Well, have you ever heard of a news influencer? From current events to controversy, online personalities are changing the way a new generation gets their daily headlines. Have a look.
Everyone that we speak to here says it's gonna be a nail biter. What direction do you think Atlantic Canada is gonna go in?
Hard to say.
So this is new. Let's see how this works.
This is Canada. Maple syrup in my cabinet.
Well, with us now are two Canadian influencers with hundreds of thousands of followers and millions of views out there. Frank Serena, better known as Frank Dominic online, is an influencer covering news and politics. And you may have heard of the Brandon Gonez Show. It streams online every week. Brandon, the founder and host, is here. Great to have you both.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, Frank, let me start with you.
right, let's hear it.
136,000 subscribers on TikTok alone. What drew you to this crazy world?
Okay, so when I was in university and high school, like being a YouTuber was like a very fresh thing.
Yeah.
But like I kind of saw that and I always liked being in drama and stuff like that. And so I was like, I want to do this. But like back then it was like a lot of like the stunt creators and like, oh, we're gonna do this silly thing. And I wasn't good at that. I'm just good at the speaking part.
Right.
And so it wasn't until the advent of TikTok where, oh, I can just press play, press stop, edit, minimal editing, don't have to worry about lighting because people don't care about that. I can just stand in front of a window. And when the convoy happened, I noticed that it was very slow for a lot of mainstream news organizations to jump in and like focus on the leaders of the convoy, who they were, their backgrounds and their associations with certain not so savory organizations.
Sure.
And some of the people who on the ground in Ottawa were basically posting on Reddit, they're posting on YouTube, they're posting on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok, and they're saying like, all these horrible things are happening, buildings are being broken into, blah, 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 like there's feces here and all this awful stuff was happening. And it would take 3 or 4 days for CBC, CTV, et cetera, to fact check that. But I could talk to the person on the phone, I could DM them and they could give me all the information, send me the pictures, and I could say, hey, this is allegedly what's happening.
Right.
And
You were quicker. You're quicker.
And that's the thing, like it sucks because I can't 100% guarantee, but I would always make sure in my videos I'm saying like, this is what somebody from Ottawa sent me.
Okay, do you consider yourself a journalist?
No, people keep asking me that, and I never went to J school, I never had formal journalism training, and so I really don't like being called a journalist, but I have broken stories or I've passed on stories to journalists before, but I am not a journalist.
Okay, Brandon, you are a
Yes.
journalist. You came from traditional TV, full disclosure. Brandon and I have worked together in the past, but now you've carved out your own space, right? Your own place. What was missing in traditional media that you wanted to give your audience?
Yeah, you know, it all came to me in the midst of the pandemic, right? Going day in, day out, and being on the front lines of what was happening in the pandemic, those who were dying, the information from governments, you know, all the different sectors. And what I would see when I would go home or just speak with friends, there was a generational divide.
Okay.
Those of a certain demographic, they were getting accurate, sourced information, and those that weren't of a certain demographic, they were kind of lost in the sauce. Wasn't sure about what was right, what was not right, what the information was, and I was always so shocked by that because I'm like, we're live all the time. We're giving all this
Right,
information. What do you
right.
mean you don't know?
Right.
What do you mean? And that's when I was realizing that how people were consuming information and where they were consuming information was totally different depending on your age demographic, for the most part. And so for me, you know, I just have a risk-taker personality. There's always been something in me where I wanted to do more, try something different. I felt like there was a gap missing in the ecosystem. And so I decided to leave and start my own digital publication called The Brandon Gonez Show, which focused on current affairs, news events, a bit of entertainment as well.
So let me jump in on that trust, because that's
Yeah.
what, you know, we're legacy media, we're trying to build trust.
Yes.
You guys are out there, you're trying to build trust. How do you fact check, especially when you don't have a giant newsroom behind you?
So this goes back to my journalistic background. So, you know, before I even tell a story, for me, I'm gonna check all different sources. I'm gonna try to get to the actual source. I'm gonna make my own phone calls. I
Right.
wanted to make sure any story that I was talking about or reporting was factually correct. So I made sure that I probably did more fact checking than I did beforehand in my new endeavor.
wow.
Because I wanted to make, because if I was wrong in my new endeavor, I knew people were not gonna come to me for that information.
Credibility
Blacklisted.
is
You
so
could get
important.
blacklisted, right?
Easy,
Easily,
easy, yeah.
You're a new player in the
Yeah.
scene. Have you ever made a mistake, Frank?
Oh.
Because you're a one-stop shop, right?
I make mistakes all the time, and I try to admit when I make those mistakes. I put out correction videos. There have been times where
Like,
I
how
have.
quickly did those come, though? Because in news, there's a process, right?
Hopefully as soon as I can, and that can be as short as a couple of hours. That can be as long as a day or two. There have been times where like somebody reaches out to me and says, "Hey, like, can you like help me?" And this is why I don't talk about like GoFundMe's, or I don't talk about any of that kind of stuff anymore, because I have incidences where people will frame something in a certain light. I say, "Hey, let's go help out this person," and then I find out information from local organizations saying they're misrepresenting themselves. This is not exactly what happened, and so that was a learning experience for me. And so part of it is like making mistakes, being wrong, learning how to be more correct, and learning where I'm comfortable saying this is what a fact is and this is what my opinion is.
Okay, and that's another interesting thing, because it seems like if you're not neutral, it sells. If you push misinformation, it sells. If you rage bait, it sells.
People love the rage bait.
Is there ever a temptation then to push the truth to get more views?
You know, the tough part is that we all know our algorithms, right? And it's no secret that the algorithms, yes, want to be as divisive as possible, right? So for me as a journalist, knowing that, I have to keep myself in check and my team in check.
How do you do that?
Well, by starting off with the fact that what is the reason why we're here?
Right.
Are we here just to evoke an emotion so we can drum up a bunch of views and likes, or are we here to tell stories that are not being told? And if you're here for the first, you're not meant to be in this particular room. But I also liken it to, Molly, like, yes, that this exists in the digital world, but this has always existed, in my opinion, in the news ecosystem. And I liken it to like our newspaper industry, right? At the forefront. Newspapers, for a large part, sided one way editorially. For the most part, right?
You're saying there were biases.
Yeah, and
Well,
there was
historically,
biases.
the papers were sponsored by unions or sponsored by political parties, and
100%.
so there is a history there.
There's a history there. And you even look at our current ecosystem, there are some publications that do that exact same thing. Very alarming headlines to sell papers.
Right,
Like that has
right.
always been a part of the ecosystem. I think it's just more pronounced now in the digital universe because the players are individual people
Yes,
who are
and
driving those narratives.
totally. And they have a generation of young people that may not be as, I don't know, looking at facts or know where to look for facts, as we see that on our show.
Well,
Right.
let's also be honest for a second, okay? The phone. The phone, I think, is one of the transformational things here, because when you get that instant gratification of a like, somebody sees your video, they like it, they're giving you affirmation. They are telling you that what you're saying matters. And that was something I struggled with right at the beginning, where because I was a very loudmouth individual growing up, child, and a lot of people pushed back on me because I would always put myself out there. I found validation through the app. And so when you're talking about like people putting up misinformation because it bleeds, it leads, all that kind of stuff, I think, especially for a lot of newer creators, they see the likes and it's intoxicating. And so the second I was able to remove myself from that, stop focusing on how many likes, how many followers, how many whatever, the second I was able to stop focusing on that, I put out less content, I put out content that I cared about more, and I was able to be more honest to my audience.
Frank, that is so hard to do, though.
It really is.
And how do you actually remove yourself from that?
I think that there has to be like a moment where you realize, like you were saying, like, what do we want to do here? So your thing is you want to make sure that you're factual, you are telling stories that aren't being heard. For me, it is, you know what I'm really here for? I'm not making money doing this. I am here to talk about the things that matter to me. So if I'm upset about education or healthcare in Ontario, if I'm upset about the way that something is happening internationally, I'm going to talk about that. And it doesn't matter if it gets 1,000 views or if it gets 100,000 views. I'm going to make that video. You see creators deleting stuff that doesn't do well, or they're trying to game the algorithm. And you have to do that if you're doing it for a living. But because this, for me, is just a hobby, I am able to chase after those things that
Right.
that really matter to me, maybe not to everybody.
So people should watch out for that. Maybe when a lot of content is being deleted, if it isn't doing well, like maybe that, just in terms of news, if you're thinking about what is actually going on.
Well, that's the big point, because in the digital ecosystem, like things can be deleted and there's no digital footprint.
Right.
Whereas before, like if you air something on TV or if you write something in the paper and it's physically there, it's there forever.
Right.
But I also think this just comes down to media literacy.
Yeah.
Right, which is not taught like in schools, and
Yeah.
it needs to be. Just like I used to be a huge advocate for financial literacy. Right, like if you don't understand how these systems work, then how are you going to be able to decipher what's real and what's not? Who's a journalist and who's a news aggregator, right? Like there's different things, and it's like understanding opinions based off of actual reports.
But that's really difficult, because in this new world, there's like the neutrality factor doesn't seem to be. It seems to be like if you're not neutral, your posts fly.
But we also have to talk about,
Right,
like,
which is
right
not
now it's the
taught,
wild,
like,
wild
in
west out
schools.
there.
And it needs
because
to
of
be.
Bill C-18,
which is in place here in Canada,
Yeah.
which tried to force these tech giants to pay journalistic organizations for their work. Meta, in response, said, heck no, we're not doing this. So in response, they banned
Right.
traditional news outlets. So what do you have left on most of Meta's platforms?
Influencers.
Influencers, but not just that. A lot of blogs that are run by people who are literally, their only game in life is to get as many views, as many likes, and whatever the cost is, social cost, they don't care. You might have a Frank and myself who, yes, we have a moral compass. We're grounded in some, in something, right? But a lot of people out there are not. And so
Right.
you'll see a bunch of fake news out there. And because our population is not media literate, they don't know how to decipher that this is fake.
Oh my goodness. Okay, education is so important because that's all we try to do here is to hopefully inform the public and to educate around these issues so that we can face this world that we're in. Frank, Brandon, I could talk to you all day. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.